was an inadequate understanding of the phenomenon, that you had to go after the states that supported and nourished terrorism, and that, of course, became an element of the Bush doctrine. So there was a kind of meeting of minds after 9/11, and the neoconservatives, so-called, had a point of view, a developed set of coherent ideas that articulated in rather sophisticated terms what I think George Bush instinctively felt after 9/11. And it's not at all surprising that he should have turned, that his speeches should have reflected that point of view. So that, like so much else that's said about the Bush administration, the charge that the neoconservative cabal is conspiring against the American interest in favor of the Israeli interest and distorting American foreign policy is simply false. It's also anti-Semitic because it rests on the ancient canard, not so ancient in America, but of dual loyalty. That is, Jews are actually never loyal to the country in which they live. They're always either loyal to their own tribe, as before there was an Israel, and since Israel came into existence, loyal to the state of Israel, and cannot be trusted to work in the interests of the United States. Of course, I've left out a lot. Let me finish quickly by just saying why I think this anti-Semitism has been dug up, resurrected, not so it's always there, so I won't say resurrected, but re-invoked in this context. And the answer is really quite simple. The enemies of the Bush doctrine, in particular the war in Iraq, but also the idea that the whole of this region has to be reshaped and regimes have to be changed and a process of democratization has to be started. That whole idea has many opponents, many enemies, and many of them found it extremely useful and convenient to first to suggest and then to say openly that this is a Jewish conspiracy, which was a way simply of discrediting the whole policy. You didn't even have to argue against it. If you said it was a Jewish conspiracy, that ipso facto proved that it was wrong and bad, and certainly bad for America and for the world. And it has actually, I'm sorry to say, succeeded to some extent, because it has also merged with the rising tide of anti-Zionism, so-called, which I have been saying now for over 30 years is increasingly difficult and indeed almost impossible to distinguish from anti-Semitism. And with the also with the revival of old-fashioned anti-Semitism throughout the world. So it all comes together in a malignant package and is like a cancer metastasizing. I don't know what the outcome will be. I only know that, like so much else in our world today, the future of Jewish security, both in the diaspora and here, I think depends on the extent to which George Bush will succeed in this enormously ambitious and I think noble enterprise on which he has embarked. I know that he is serious about it, and he's very strong and determined, the most extraordinary individual, very sort of like Harry Truman, I mean, someone who has been reborn in response to a major crisis. But he's not a lone free agent, and a lot depends. Everything depends on whether he gets reelected and how much political support he can mobilize at home. If he succeeds even partly, it will certainly be good for America, it will be good for the world, it will be good for the Jews. If he fails, it will be a disaster. Just on the issue of whether it's good for the Jews, bad for the Jews, I remember, and I'll conclude with this, give you a sense of what the climate came to be like. Before the invasion of Iraq, Richard Pearl was on Meet the Press, very important Sunday show, interview show, Sunday morning show. And the moderator said to him, in a very challenging tone. He put up on the screen something Pearl had written about how it would be very good if there were more democracies in the Middle East. And the moderators in the interview said to him, well, what do you have to say about that? I mean, it is said that you believe that your purpose in advocating the invasion of Iraq and the toppling of Saddam Hussein is to begin surrounding Israel with democratic countries. He said in this, as though this was some kind of nefarious objective. And Pearl, who is a man of great poise and self-confidence and self-assurance, for once in his life looked totally bewildered. And he said to him, well, I don't exactly see what's wrong with democratic societies, whether they surround Israel or they don't. The moderator then looked totally bewildered because he simply assumed that, he caught him, you see. You're going to surround Israel with democratic society. That's what you're up to. That's your hidden agenda. Well, that's the sort of thing that's the sort of fatuousness and that you get. It's one of the byproducts of anti-Semitism. No, this particular interview is certainly not an anti-Semite. I know him. But he was infected by this climate in which everybody was so sure that Richard Pearl was the head of this neoconservative cabal. Well, that's I'll say once again, I think everything depends now on whether the Bush doctrine is implemented over, I don't mean the next year, I mean over the next 3 or 4 decades. I've called this, I and some others have called this World War IV, World War III being the Cold War. World War III took 45 years. This will probably take that long too. And with any luck, I won't be here to see it, but we'll win as we won World War III. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Yeah, sure.
We'll take them in order. First, Professor Menachem Milson, Dr. Dory Gold, and Edward Cohen. So, Menachem, please.
Norman, 2 questions. One, could you say something about the role played by Jews, American Jews, Jewish liberals, other kind of Jews, in these attacks on neoconservatism? That's one. And also, if you can distinguish between the Jewish attacks or Jews who attack neoconservatism, and are some of them now aware of the anti-Semitic aspect, and what do they do with that? That's one. And the other, are there some exceptions to the anti-neoconservatism in academia and in the major media? Are there exceptions? Thank you.
Well, on the first question, I should have made this point in my talk. Actually, the charge that the Jews were dragging the United States into war in Iraq was especially ridiculous in view of the fact that a majority of American Jews were against going to war in Iraq. I mean, most American Jews are liberals, and they are very, it's an am kishay oref in that respect. Although things may begin to change now, there are some signs that things are changing, but certainly true to their liberal religion, most American Jews were, like most American liberals, opposed to going to war in Iraq. I mean, they wanted the UN, whatever they wanted, but they didn't want they didn't want the United States to do what it did. So there was a sharp distinction between the Jews and the neoconservative intellectuals or policy makers. And the Jews, for the most part, also attacked the neoconservatives, but not just over Iraq. I mean, many American Jews think that for a Jew to not be a liberal is like to be a Meshumad. I mean, it is equivalent to apostasy. I'm actually quite serious about this. It is regarded, I am sometimes regarded by people I used to know the way my grandfather would regarded in Meshumad. They said Shiva for me. They sat Shiva for me when I broke ranks. The equivalent of it, anyway, whatever the equivalent of it is. So the neoconservatives were non grata, long before the war in Iraq. And incidentally, the neoconservatives of today, the ones who are being attacked, are already a second and third generation. Some of them are not neo at all, neo meaning new to conservatism. Somebody like Bill Kristol, the son of Irving Kristol, my own son, were born into this political tendency, so there's nothing neo about them. The question, the other question you raised about whether there are exceptions, it's very hard to think of any in the circles you mentioned. Very hard. I mean, there are admirers, but they tend to come from a different direction, and not many of them are Jewish, I'm sorry to say. The most passionate, I've just been at the Herzliya conference, the most passionate speech in defense of Israel and of the Jewish people has been made, and that entire conference was made by Pat Robertson yesterday, the American Christian evangelical minister. And incidentally, that's true in the United States. The strongest supporters of Israel in the United States are the evangelical Christians, much more than the Jews now. No, there are, if there are exceptions, they're like what I used to call the Moranos. I would sometimes speak in universities and get a very cold reception, and boos and so on. And then when I left, somebody would come up and say, "I agree with you," and he'd run away. I called those, they were the Moranos, you see. I think you were next.
Yeah, Dori.
Well, actually, Professor Milson anticipated my question. I was just going to perhaps slightly modify it in saying that in the attack on the Jewish loyalty or the accusation of dual loyalty back in the 1930s, when Roosevelt was contemplating war with the Axis powers, the Jews were clearly not going to be on the side of those, in America, on the side of those attacking Roosevelt. But here, you do have a situation where, as you said before, a significant portion of the Jewish community is attacking Bush, and therefore I was wondering how they feel about the assault on the neoconservatives, whether you sense people saying, look, I don't agree with you, I support Howard Dean, but this is anti-Semitism. Have you sensed that kind of a response?
No, you see, I mean, this is a fight I've been having for over 30 years. Whenever you raise the charge of anti-Semitism, somebody, usually a Jewish critic, will say, well, just because you criticize Sharon doesn't mean you're an anti-Semite. And, I fall asleep at that point. I can hardly bring myself to argue any longer. There's been there's a real effort, and it's true in Israel too, I noticed, that to deny the rise of anti-Semitism or the extent to which anti-Zionism is a mask for anti-Semitism now. But there are some people, unless you actually take a Jew and shove him into an oven, you can't be called an anti-Semite. And even then, there's some question as to whether, Hannah Arendt raised a question about that. She actually said that Eichmann was not really an anti-Semite. Now, I mean, so it becomes extremely difficult to have any kind of rational discussion because people, if I say, this is a table, and you say, what are you talking about? That's a chair. I don't know how to deal with that. It's an epistemological conundrum. And I have written, I don't know, 1 million words trying to define anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, very careful, making careful distinctions and discriminations. And all I ever get is, well, just because I criticize Israel doesn't mean I'm an anti-Semite, says an anti-Semite, like Pat Buchanan, who's openly, but they keep denying that they are. They do not fly under their true flag. And that's true of the Jews. The liberal Jews have it. And this is true, I think, on the Israeli left. I've read articles in Haaretz poo-pooing the idea that there's a rise in anti-Semitism in Europe. It's making light of it. It's nothing. A little bit among Muslims.
Edward Cohen, then gentleman there, Judge Bach.
My question, too, was to some extent anticipated. I was going to ask about Pat Robertson and, in fact, about the whole Christian Zionist movement. Is there any relationship between that movement and the so-called neocons?
Well, it depends what you mean by relationship. I mean, I've written a lot of controversial articles in my life, and I've gotten into a lot of trouble. The most trouble I ever got into was when I wrote an article called In Defense of Pat Robertson. People who were contributing money to commentary, I must have cost commentary at least $100,000, not to mention angry denunciations that continue to this very day. My defense of Pat Robertson, to put it very in a nutshell, it was a long article, consisted of saying that the fact that he is so passionate a supporter of Israel, and at that point also of Soviet Jewry, trumped the ridiculous stuff that he had written, or somebody had written in his name, about the Masonic Jewish conspiracy of the 18th century. I could live with that nonsense about the 18th century in exchange for the passionate support for Israel today. I said the same thing, by the way, about Solzhenitsyn. I saw Pat Robertson at this conference. He had no idea who I was, if that tells you anything about the relation, even though I had sort of sacrificed for him to know who I was. There is a relationship only in the sense that many of us, not all by the way, but many of us have been trying to persuade our fellow Jews that these people are friends and not enemies, and that with no success, by the way, or hardly any. So to that extent, there is a relationship. But there's very, very little personal contact, a little bit. Not much. We operate sort of along parallel lines, but the truth of the matter is that, look, every animal in nature is born with the instinct for knowing who is the enemy and who is the prey, who's going to eat you and who you can eat. This is the basic instinct of survival. And although we were promised that Zionism and the State of Israel would normalize the Jewish people and sort of erase all the pathologies of the diaspora, this is one pathology that I think has not been cured by Zionism. Jews, I think, continue to have difficulty in knowing who their enemies are and who their friends are. And there is something totally perverse about the response of the American Jewish community, because you see, even most liberal Jews support Israel. Most liberal Jews support Israel, whatever else. They may want peace and so on, they may support peace now, but they're for Israel. They're certainly, in whatever sense. And that they cannot recognize that these 60 million people in the United States are the strongest bulwark that Israel has is, I think, a little meshuggah, to tell you the truth. Because the fact is that many American Jews think that when Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai with the tablets, on one there was not the Aseret HaDibrot were not on them. On one was written gay rights, and on the other was written free choice for abortion. Those are the two overriding mitzvot. And that's why they all hate the Christian right, because Christian right is against gay rights and is against abortion. And that is more important than anything else, including its support of Israel.
Yes, please say your name.
My name is Mavnol Groshe. I'm a student of political science and sociology. I'm here as an intern. Ideological belief systems, ideologies, ideas, and anti-Semitism among them are usually generated under and produced by certain social circumstances. And sometimes they get detached from the circumstances, they get detached from the origin and exported to other areas. So the question about anti-Semitism in the United States. Oh, and the thing is, if we look at society and we see a phenomenon, a belief system, an idea like anti-Semitism there, and we know it's just like an export from another society, we shouldn't be too worried, because we know it's there and it will never prevail too much in extent. If we have the circumstances generating, producing this belief system on the ground, there's actually reason to be worried, because then it can grow and extend, and then it can trigger a bigger development. So my first question for you would be, do you think that if we look at American society today, do we have there the circumstances on the ground that produce anti-Semitism, or is it rather just an export of an old belief system from Europe that some people sympathize with and others not, and we don't really have a reason to worry about? This is the one question. My second question would be, if we look on neoconservatism, I don't know, sometimes, I mean, like what happened in the Enlightenment was that old belief systems, religions, and so on were actually questioned, and at some point people actually started to recognize that they can't live without this belief system. So people were enlightened enough to forget about their old religions, but were actually not enlightened enough to go back to new belief systems that replaced what actually had been missing before. So I don't know, I'm sometimes willing to look at the new conservatism as kind of a third stage of an enlightenment, that we finally start to recognize now, after we question all the religious belief systems and all the ideologies, come back to the conclusion that we as human beings can't actually live without them. And so there's kind of a third stage of an enlightenment. After we question everything that we said, we go back to it because we understood that as human beings we can deal without them.
Well, you have 2 days. I'll start. Your first question is neither of the above. You pose two alternatives. Are there circumstances that account for the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, or is it imported from abroad? Neither one. I mean, there are indigenous sources of anti-Semitism in the United States. I do not believe it is a serious worry in the United States. I have great faith in the resistance of American society and the American political system to this disease, which doesn't mean it doesn't float around. Really, what happened, I mean, I can't go into the whole story, but, you know, there's, well, I mean, America was settled by Europeans, so you can say it was imported from abroad, although the Europeans who settled America were very philo-Semitic, especially when they said the Bible, they generally meant the Old Testament, and they saw themselves, they identified themselves with the children of Israel. So you also have this very strong philo-Semitic tradition. But there are anti-Semites in the United States. You know, not numerous, but some of them have, you know, followings. And what happened, to put it briefly, was that the open expression of anti-Semitism was a taboo for about 25 years after the Holocaust. You simply couldn't say anything vaguely anti-Semitic without being excommunicated from polite society or the mainstream. The 1967 war smashed that taboo. The Jews suddenly turned from victims into victors, and the whole thing was turned around. And incidentally, I said it at the time that we were beginning to see the return of anti-Semitism. It happened originally through the black radicals, who were very openly anti-Semitic in the after '67. I've written a lot about this, if you know, I can refer you to it. What's happened lately is that these beliefs have become more and more acceptable, and there's no longer a real taboo, although there's enough of one so that you can't be, it's very hard to be openly anti-Semitic, you have to be anti-Zionist. That's the cover, and why anti-Zionism has become so popular. What's happened is that a lot of these beliefs that had been smoldering underground simply flamed up because they were allowed to. I don't even think because of circumstances. People now blame Israel for the rise in anti-Semitism. There are now, I've read now half a dozen articles saying it's all Israel's fault, and if Sharon would only evacuate the settlements, or if there were a peace plan, there would be no more anti-Semitism. Actually, a very distinguished historian wrote a big article in the New York Review of Books recently, Tony Judd, blaming Israel for the rise in anti-Semitism and advocating a one-state solution. You know, the two-state solution impossible. Israel is now making life uncomfortable for Jews everywhere, and the whole thing was a mistake to begin with, and we now have to undo that mistake by working toward a secular, democratic, you know, Palestine. And he's not alone. He's Jewish, by the way. So the fact that Israel is being blamed, I mean, I don't buy this at all. I think it's opposition to Israel is a convenient justification for beliefs that were there to begin with. The second question about neoconservatism as a third stage of enlightenment. Well, neoconservatism, certainly, many neoconservatives either are religious themselves in some sense or pro-religious. I mean, they want everybody else to be religious. You know, it's like the Jew who's treif, but who wants the rabbi to be kosher. You know, I mean, somebody has to be kosher, not him. Religion is good for society. I mean, all neoconservatives believe that. Some of them think that it's not necessary for them, but it's good for everybody else. They are certainly pro-religion, whereas so-called Enlightenment intellectuals are, of course, anti-religious, and that's one of the main distinguishing marks. Your question is much too sweeping historically for me to deal with it in such short compass.
Well, we have a long list of questions. I don't know how many I can take. Judge Bach, and thereafter Yair Shelek.
I've got a more limited question. I must say, ever since the Iraqi war and the attacks on the Bush government, Bush administration for accepting imprecise information on the part of intelligence about the fatal armaments in Iraq and so on, well, you know this, I must say that I somehow expected, I had been afraid that some circles in the government or outside, or these circles that you refer to, might blame Israel or Israeli intelligence for supplying false information to the American intelligence. Now this, I understand, so far has not been done. Now you must have heard that about 2 weeks ago, suddenly someone, a former high official of the Israeli intelligence, expressed his astonishment why inquiry committees in England and America had so far disregarded Israel's role in supplying in supplying false information or exaggerated information to the American intelligence, etc. Now I found this scandalous and hard to believe that on the Israeli side, a person of very high rank, such comments should be. But what I wanted to ask you, have there been any repercussions in America to these reports from Israel and from Israel circles, and has this been used by anyone against Israel?
Well, surprisingly not, or I should say not yet. I think they've been a little slow on the uptake. If I were they, I would have jumped on this story, but maybe they don't read the right papers or something. But I mean, I have to say though that if it's true, I mean, that is to say, if there was some information that came from Israeli intelligence, there would be nothing so either surprising or terrible about it. I mean, the intelligence sources on which both Bush and Blair based their judgments came from many, many different countries. I mean, from Pakistan, from all over. It was not just the CIA or MI6. They had multiple sources. I know this for a fact. I mean, they had multiple sources of intelligence. Possibly the Mossad was one. I don't know. I mean, it wouldn't really matter much. But the fact is that no one, including not Hans Blix, questioned the existence of these programs of weapons of mass destruction. No one denied that Saddam Hussein had not demonstrated or proved that he destroyed the stockpiles that everyone said